The life-sustaining water running through southwest Florida and into the Gulf is threatened by urban growth, agricultural runoff, and the explosion of red tide that leaves this beautiful beach covered in dead fish for months at a time.
It's really dangerous. And we are a tourist economy. If people don't come to Naples, we're out of business. So for us, it's very important to make sure that we are committed to the environment, that we are doing our part. It's that it is the lifeblood of what goes on here in Naples.
Southwest Florida's unique environment has long been a magnet for people. As the population grows, so does the challenge of protecting this coast, a lesson each new generation inherits.
I have a picture of here, Daddy with one of his big hauls of Goliath grouper. He's with his mother in this picture. He was kind of legendary as a fisherman. He learned how to fish these waters. He could have been a commercial fishing guide. Really, he was that good. He really was. That's kind of brings me to an interesting story. Daddy was a developer, and he at one time bought a lot of property out in the Estero Bay. It was mostly mangroves. And he had this wild idea of developing this. And a guy came along, I think he may have just been a fisherman, maybe came from that area, but he started fighting this. And out of this struggle between Daddy and this early environmentalist, because we're talking the early 60s before I think the word environmentalism had even been heard. Out of this struggle came the Estero Bay Aquatic Preserve, which is the first aquatic preserve in the history of the United States. I'd love to meet the man who struggled with my father over this issue at that time. I want to shake his hand and thank him.
Well, I was born right here, about 93 years.
Were you an environmentalist back then?
Well, I guess you'd have to call me one. But what got me involved was we lived on Fort Myers Beach, and we had 3 small children, and
Not much money.
and very little money, but I had a boat and I knew how to catch fish. So I fished in Estero Bay, and we had a lot of our food came from fishing Estero Bay.
Our children loved it and would take them out in the bay. We did something called cricking. In between the mangrove islands, there would be a passage, a small passage, and you could get the small boat through between the 2 islands. We call them islands, even though they're just mangrove trees growing in the water. And we learned to love every aspect of the bay.
Yeah.
It was like our own backyard, our own private park. But we shared it with everybody, and we wanted it to always be available to the public.
And when it looked like they were going to dredge it all up, a group of us got together and formed the Lee County Conservation Association. And we managed to block it and stop it from being done.
And the man who was going to build it, the development called it, he was going to build a city the size of Fort Lauderdale, and it would just take up almost all of the bay.
I have a surprise for you two. Cynthia Williams.
Yes, I wanted to meet you both and let you know that my father was Barry C. Williams.
Oh my goodness,
Well,
Barry
Yeah.
C. Wait, you're his daughter?
Yes, I know you probably don't know I existed, but I do, and I want you to know that above anything else, I want you to know how grateful I am to
Yeah.
you for stopping Daddy and all of his
Yeah.
gang from devastating Estero Bay. Thank you.
thank you, thank you.
That's
Well,
wonderful. I'm so glad to meet you and know that you don't resent what we did.
Of course not. It
Yeah.
cost us a few $1 million, but no.
Well, I'm so glad that you all came together and you had this opportunity
Yeah.
to reunite. Thank you for
Yeah.
saving Estero Bay and just setting a precedent around the country.
There's no way anyone can thank you adequately for what you did.
Yeah.
Could I shake your hand? Of course. It's so good to meet you and know that everything's okay. Yeah.
I just love this picture. It shows my mom as a teenager, my aunt, my grandparents fishing off of Fort Myers Beach. That's what I remember the most about my grandparents, is fishing with them. Bass fishing in freshwater or saltwater fishing, always fishing. That's what I remember the most.
My father survived the hurricane. He was 13 years old. He was the oldest of 6 children. His mother, 5 brothers and sisters drowned. during the hurricane, and his aunt and uncle and 2 cousins also drowned. This is my dad. He was a farmer in the Glades with his partner, and they are standing in a celery field.
For me, it's a family history of survival, just resiliency. And I myself was in a car accident when I was 19, and I sustained a spinal cord injury. That's why I'm in a wheelchair. And I had to survive that. So just knowing that history of resiliency, I think added to my resiliency.
The interesting thing about this picture is this is one of the Santinis, and my Uncle Milton caught and trained the dolphin that would become Flipper. I do know the song, but I'm not going to sing it.
They call him Flipper, Flipper, faster than lightning.
The Kelly and Santini families have pioneered in Chokoloskee Island, Key West, and Fort Myers, and I currently live in Fort Myers. We were either fishermen or we were farmers. So the fishermen lived closer to the beach and the farmers lived closer to the mainland. I love this photograph. It's my dad and I, and we're playing cards, and we're actually on a boat. This is my dad when he was in the Navy. He's part of the greatest generation. He served for 3 years in the Navy during World War II. After he came back from the war, he married my mother a couple of years later, and he was a potato farmer in the Iona area for all of his life. But what happened in Southwest Florida in the 60s, air conditioning became very mainstream. And now, all of a sudden, you could live in Southwest Florida and not have to endure the heat and the mosquitoes. And so farm fields went away and they became really beautiful developments, but the residents lost their livelihood. So they had been poor, but they could feed their families. And then when the farm fields went away, the families fell into poverty. And so now we're looking at 2nd and 3rd generation poverty, and multi-generational poverty is difficult to get out of. And so that's one of the reasons we established the Heights Center, is we bring education to the families that live here, and we work to build self-sufficient families in this neighborhood.
Catherine Kelly, an architect, founded the Heights Center to work with the children and grandchildren of those workers. A place of hope for families mired in poverty, on the edge of paradise.
The community center itself was something that the residents of the neighborhood wanted. And so for me, it was really a no-brainer. I built buildings for 20 years, and we want the kids to feel like they're at home here, and that they're safe, and that they're loved, and I think we do that.
When you look at this table, you have lots of images here of your family by the water.
I see generations of 2 families that came together that have lived off the land in South Florida and are inured in that whole lifestyle of being around the water. So everywhere you look for either fields or fishing boats. That absolutely describes my family. Okay, well, I love that one. Let's start with that one.
Okay.
Somewhere in the 50s, my mother bought a spear gun, and it was the first spear gun ever sold in Lee County from my dad. We didn't have money, but we had a little boat, and so that was our recreation always.
Who's this in this photograph?
Well, that's me. That is a black grouper who weighed about 70 pounds.
That you eat, or?
Oh, sure. Everything that we kill, we eat.
Okay.
It's never just for sport. We have 5 generations of my family on this table. One of the earliest ones would be right here. This is one of my uncles mending a fish net down at Fort Myers Beach. And then this would be the nets drying out in front of his house.
Why is this called the Paradise Coast?
It's beautiful, and if you love the water, it's just an amazing place to be. It's an adventure, always.
The water, used wisely, is the lifeline that sustains the mangroves, wildlife, fields, and families whose lives are intertwined closely with the land and the sea.
There are other images on this table which go way back in terms of Southwest Florida history.
This is Dennis Kelly and Olive Santini. This is the marriage of the Kelly and Santini families in the early 1900s. She was born and raised in Chokoloskee Island, and I can't imagine what it would have been like to make a living back then and raise all the kids that they did on tiny little Chokoloskee Island, but they did.
One of the 10,000 islands Chokoloskee was once a lawless place, where outlaws came to escape and traders came to find their fortunes.
The magnet that draws us to Chokoloskee is this old country store, Smallwoods. Captain Ted, who came to Chokoloskee in 1896, is gone now, but the store continues under the management of his daughter, Thelma.
A moment of historical deja vu. We introduce Catherine Kelly to Lynn Smallwood McMillan. Their ancestors first met right here in 1901.
Her grandfather, or maybe her
Great-grandfather.
is the one that my grandfather bought Chokoloskee from, the island.
The deed says $600, and the folklore says, and a barrel of whiskey. Which sounds about right.
Yeah.
The Smallwood store, a trading post, opened in 1906.
They would come from, all over, and the Seminoles too. They would come out of the rivers and down here to trade. They'd bring their furs and their hides. They'd bring a lot of fresh meat for the settlers. And they would camp out here beside the store whenever the run boats were expected until they came, and then they could get the supplies they needed.
During Prohibition, families from this area were rum runners, including two of my great uncles in the Santini family. They grew up here, and so they knew the 10,000 Islands like the back of their hand, so they could outrun anybody that was after them, although they did eventually get caught.
And what happened to them?
Oh, they went to jail.
This place has a kind of a history of people who have like alternative economies happening down here.
This whole area really, in some ways, was an alternative economy if you think about it, because I know they hunted alligators. I know they hunted snowy egret feathers, the beautiful white plumes that you see, because those would get shipped overseas.
This alternative economy gave way when the Everglades were designated a national park in 1947. Commercial activities were regulated, changing the lives of everyone on these islands. Stone crabs and tourism now drive the economy.
But it's been hard, like even with the stone crabbing. The regulations tend to get stiffer and stiffer as time goes by. Harder to stay in business. We have tourists now, and we're all captains, and we all take people on boat tours. Airboats, any kind of boat we have, they can go. That's basically the livelihoods, restaurants, motels. It's all catered towards tourism.
Lynn maintains the Smallwood store, but now is a museum that pays tribute to her family and the Everglades pioneers.
This is my grandfather and my grandmother. This is my two aunts and two of my uncles, and then the baby was my Uncle Ted. He was the youngest at the time. They had 6 children. My mother, she was 18 when that photograph was taken. She was born in 1921, and she was the only one that was born in a hospital, and they were up in Fort Myers, was the closest.
Did she end up living here as well?
Oh yeah, she did. She grew up here, she lived here. So I grew up coming down to the store here every day to get the mail and aggravate my aunt probably.
Would you ever consider leaving this place?
Not full time, no. Maybe for a few months in the summer when the mosquitoes are horrible. But when you're a water person, it's hard to move away.
Like so many, we came to Southwest Florida in search of paradise. We found descendants of pioneers and newcomers, building on their strong family legacies and passing down the history of this remarkable place. Helping new generations face the future with confidence, hope, and the responsibility to protect this land, this water that stretches almost forever. Because the spirit, mystery, and promise of vitality that flows through the Everglades is the key to finding paradise.